Welcome back to another reading and correcting with me, Kindar, the Tiger Knights, and Ty, the Tiger Supervisor. These are where I read a chapter from one of my stories and correct it as I go. If you want to listen to these live, it's every Tuesday morning, 8 a.m. Eastern Time on Twitch. And if you're looking to support me, that is on my Patreon. Today we are doing chapter 50 of Breaking Step. Has anyone seen Dawn? Tibs asked as he sat at the table. The sorcerer's seat was unoccupied. The others shook their head. Can't you tell where is it? Where what? Where he is. Can't you tell where he is? Jekyll asked between bites. Tibs was the one shaking his head this time. He wasn't at the house he stayed in last time. The owner had confirmed what Tibs' sense told him. He would know you found him. He wouldn't know you already found him there, Commodore said. He then ran the roofs for a while, but the only source of corruption he'd come across was the pool. He'd even gone there to check in case Don was using it to mask his presence. Then he'd gone to the other places he'd expect the sorcerer to be in, since he couldn't sense the whole of the town. And hadn't found him by the time he decided sleep was the better option. Has Don been in since last night? Tibbs asked the server as she placed a plate and tankard before him. The last time he was eating with you, she said. That had been before the run. He'll turn up, Mez said. Not if he's at the guild, Jekyll pointed out. Wouldn't the guards be here by now? The archer asked. Maybe he's letting Tibbs stew and worry. The fighter replied, you know how Don is. The guild building was one place he couldn't sense from the outside, and not well inside because of all the weaves that made it out. Don might be hiding there, but that would mean he at least suspected Tibbs could sense people and track them that way. The sorcerer was smart, but had Tibbs done anything that could lead him to think that? As far as Tibbs could determine, Don was not within the guild building. His excuse to go had been a training session with Alistair, but his way of determining it had been to ask around if anyone had seen Don, as with the server, anyone who had seen him before their run. Can multiple people work on the same etching? Tibbs asked while practicing forming Jeer. Of course, Alistair replied. Anyone who has learned a specific etching can then make it. No, I mean on the same etching at the same time. You mean rituals? Tibbs shrugged. It wasn't like he'd asked the Dragaling what it was called. That's more the area of weaving, his teacher said, because etching requires sustained focus to determine its effect, and that's difficult to achieve with multiple people involved. Unless they were created by the same dungeon and might have the same way of thinking. Now, his teacher said, use that focus of yours. No, use that focus on your practice instead of asking questions. Are you sure? Lamberto asked. What? Tibbs asked back, looking at the noble rogue and the lock he held. Lamberto had found him at the inn and asked if Tibbs had the time to help him train. More because Lamberto had asked than because he felt he needed the distraction, Tibbs had agreed. Okay, I'd bothered asking. No, that's not... okay. Instead of demanded. More because Lamberto had asked, instead of demanded, than because he felt he needed the distraction, Tibbs had agreed. Are you sure this is the tension bar I should use? He took a thin one from his roll of tools. It seems flimsy. Why had he told him to use that one? Had he said that? Which one do you think you should use? He might as well turn this into a different lesson then. You're distracted. Lamberto ran a finger over the set of tension bars, from the thinnest to the thickest, discreetly watching Tibbs, who didn't react. He took one, compared it to the lock's opening, then another. Trouble with a teammate. Tibbs finally admitted, as Lamberto inserted it and then selected a pick. Does happen. Tibbs. Tibbs sensed the rogue move the pick and test the tumblers. My brother. Okay, right. The reason I don't really care for this here is that it strongly gives the impression that Tibbs is the one talking. And the fact that the sense part was just to keep the focus on what Lamberto is doing, but so I don't need it per se. Uh does happen. The nobles that becomes a comma. That is no longer capitalized. Does happen, the noble said, moving the pick and testing the tumblers. My brothers are always bickering about the team. If father let them, they'd each go off and form their own. Why won't he? Tibbs was surprised. Silas had seemed to defer to Paladin for every decision during their run. Punishment, I think. Lamberto loosened the tension too much and the tumblers unset. Their rivalry played a part in why we had to move here, so he's forcing them to work together. That's going to get you killed. I don't think so, he replied with confidence, then was quiet as he went back to testing the tumblers. They've realized that if we don't work together, we aren't going to make it through. So they set that aside. Them, yeah, I know them. I was referring to rivalry, but I don't like it. So they set that aside for the runs. He smirked, but it might be because the lock clicked open. Then they picked those right up once we're done. He pulled the shackle, turned it, and locked it again. I'm sure your teammate will set the problem aside for your next run. Tibbs wished he believed that, but after 4 days of the occasional search amidst everything else, keeping him busy and no success in locating the sorcerer, he was worried about what he might be planning. Tibbs sensed the gamma level. The gamma level with Earth as their element. The gamma level person. Like, he can't tell the difference between a clerk and an adventurer. All he can tell are levels. So, let's go. He's going to suppose it's an adventure, which I need to address. Tibbs sensed the gamma level adventurer with Earth as their element approached the inn, and he considered running. That there was only one was to his advantage, but gamma meant he didn't know what it meant, other than the guild thought it was all that they needed to bring him in. Was that because Dawn hadn't worked out enough to provide an accurate description of Tibbs's ability? Or because there was so much more Tibbs didn't know about higher ranking adventurers? The latter, he decided. Dawn wouldn't underestimate him at this point. So he stayed in his seat, but put most of the papers in his satchel. No point in looking like he was ready to go, but he didn't want to delay this any more than he had to. He only had the week's account when the adventurer stopped the table and waited. And I do address it, so I guess I just forgot to put it up previously. What he saw of him out of the corner of his eyes didn't fit an adventurer. So he looked up at the fidgeting clerk. He was well dressed and had the medallion around his neck that Tibbs had worked out. Only the higher ranked clerk had. Clerks, plural. Higher ranked clerks had. Mr. Lightfinger? He almost stammered. Had he meant for it to be a question? He continued in a trembling voice. I've been tasked with escorting you to Guild Leader Tarania's office. Was he scared? It's such an honor. Tibbs stared, and the med fidgeted more. This was not the behavior he'd expected of someone tasked with bringing him in. But he'd also expected Irdian to be the one who Tibbs would be taken to. With Tirania, he might be able to minimize the damage Dawn had caused him. Maybe even turn it to his advantage by offering his service to her. No, that wouldn't work. He wasn't some adventurer in the wild. The guild owned him. He put the last papers in the satchel and stood. He handed it to Krosef as they walked by. See to it Duran gets it, he continued before the server got over his surprised expression. Over surprised. Yeah, I don't need. He doesn't get over the expression. He got over his surprise. He'd written a note informing the merchant to take over as best as he could if he didn't hear from Tibs in a few days. However this turned out, Tibs didn't see getting out of this without some time in the cells. Can I ask you something? The clerk asked uncertainly. Tyranny had picked an odd one to bring Tibs in. Was this to set him at ease, make him think there was a chance he could run? Did you really go into the dungeon alone to take on that renegade? There was an odd eagerness to the tone. I know you protected Rock. I was here for the last attacks, but I'd never think a runner would go in and defend a dungeon. Not after the way it's used. It's used to make your life miserable. What was the man after? Tibbs admitting without considering Stowe a friend? About considering Stowe a friend? That Stowe was a person after a fashion instead of just some creature? He couldn't refuse to answer, so he settled on a mix of it and lies. I didn't go in to save the dungeon. I wanted to keep Bardic from doing something he'd get punished for. We were friends, or I thought we were. Did you know he was planning on destroying it? This couldn't be about making him an accomplice, could it? They had Bardic already. No, I figured he was up to something, but us rogue always are. Yes, you are. The man laughed and seemed finally at ease. Like you and that racket of yours. Tibbs heard the sarcasm in the word. If the commander didn't have a sword planted so firmly up his ass, he'd see that you're just doing the same thing his guards are. No, same thing as his guards. You're only going about it in a way that those who don't trust him can accept. I don't think Erdogan would see anything with that up there. The man looked at him surprised, then burst out laughing. No, I guess he'd be busy dealing with the pain. Although, with metal as an element, he might not have to feel it. He might not have to feel it. I can minimize the damage Earth attacks cause me, he added at Tibbs's raised eyebrow, and he's much stronger than I am. You don't like him much, he risked. This had to be about getting Tibbs to be at ease, so he would say something incriminating. The man sighed. I don't like his type. More interested in the rules than doing good for the people living under them. That seems like an odd attitude, Tibbs said, considering you work for the guild. What do you mean? There was an eagerness to the question that felt authentic and put Tibbs on guard. Was that it? Get him to admit he hated the guild? Don could have told them that, couldn't he? The guild left us to fend for ourselves when Sebastian attacked. Oh no, they didn't. From what I was told, because the siege took place when the dungeon had closed its door, we didn't have a lot of people here, and they were busy defending guild properties from his attacks. It's why Tyrannia tasked you and Dawn with banding the runners to defend the city, isn't it? There was no light on any of the words. This man believed everything he'd been told about how things had supposedly gone down. Was he really what he seemed like? Some person overly eager to meet Tibbs, to meet the hero of Craggle Rock? There was something of Lamberto the first time they met. In the man's smile and tone. He nodded. All he'd do in trying to convince this man he'd been lied to about the events. All he'd do in trying to convince this man he'd been lied to was to make himself sound desperate to turn him against the guild. He'd seen how those inside it were. Even Alistair, with all his good intentions, went along with how the guild worked. Tib saw no result of his claim of trying to change things from the inside. His guard kept talking, an eager recounting of Tibbs's exploit, wrapped within an altered version of what had taken place. The guild didn't outright claim he and Don had acted purely under its instruction, but there was a strong hinting that Tyrannia had been the guiding hand behind every element of defense that had taken place. In the distance, he sent someone with corruption appear within his sense as they exited the guild building, and just the guild. It would be Dawn. Yeah, the power level matched, and the only other Tibs could think would be here were the corruption sorcerers, but they would be by the pool and much stronger than the one now walking away. So Dawn hadn't wanted to be there to witness Tibbs being brought in. It made sense. The sorcerer wasn't brave, and he couldn't know what Tibbs might be capable in the seconds they were together, and people still underestimated him. The thing was, Tibbs realized, he didn't want to hurt Don. There was anger, but mainly disappointment. He'd wanted to talk things out this time. He tried, but it was a sorcerer who had managed to stay hidden, probably in the guild, and had caused things to escalate. The man vanished from his sense as he walked out of Tibbs's range amid one of the small merchant plaza that were becoming numerous. Still, Tibbs would do what he had to turn the situation to his advantage, even if it meant making Don seem like someone whose mind had been eaten by the dungeon. How far he could push the idea Don had lied to them would depend on if the guild had a way to know if Tibbs had more than one element. He couldn't see how they would, as far as the guild was concerned. It was impossible to gain more than one element, or so everyone had told him. Most of whom were people, Most of whom were people within the guild, or who got their information from someone inside the guild. Maybe going in was not a good idea. He considered running as the building came into view, but there were now a lot more people with elements in the street, on its side, and among the alleys. Some were runners, but there were a lot of people with much stronger elements among them. And those and were those watching him and his escort? Were they there because this was Tibbs's last chance to run? They'd stop him if he tried, and he would have branded himself as guilty of whatever Don had told them. Since Tyrannia was who Tibbs was going to see there, yeah, okay, this is literally a repeat of before. Da, 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 da. So let's move that here. Yeah. And, it's shown, okay. Running wasn't needed. Since Tyrannia was who Tibbs was going to see, and he'd shown himself to be her ally, so, okay, yeah, and that's no longer needed. Running wasn't needed, right? They entered the guild building without fanfare, without much of anything. Greetings were exchanged, some waved and a few pointed, but it was all much as, but it was all much like any time Tibbs had walked in. Everyone within the guild seemed to know each other. No one followed or took position around them as they proceeded through the corridors until they reached a door Tibbs could tell was Tyrannia, since Tyrannia's since he was no longer affected by the weave of confusion that were in the walls. His escort nodded and gave him a smile. Was that supposed to be encouraging? Knocked, not nodded, knocked. And gave him a smile. Is that supposed to be encouraging? Come in. His escort opened the door and motioned for him to enter. She looked up from the paper she read, her expression wary. The stack of them on her desk was thick. Sit, she ordered. then went back to reading. Could all those be about what be because of what Don had told her? Had he been here all this time? Not hiding as did thoughts, but telling his story, whatever that was? And that concludes chapter 50 of Breaking Step. If you are enjoying this, please leave a like. If you want to know when the next chapter is going to be up, subscribe and hit the bell. If you want to read the story, it is available on Royal Road for free. If you want to read ahead of Royal Road and support me in the process, that is on my Patreon. And if you want to listen to these live, that's every Tuesday morning, 8 a.m. Eastern Time on Twitch. The links are in the note, and with that, I shall wish you a good day.